I'm going to speak for a few minutes on U.S. policy that impacts the development of the U.S., the East Med energy resources, and particularly, obviously, the substantial gas deposit in the East Med. My main thesis is that there is a major shift taking place in U.S. oil and gas policy that will have implications for the development of East Med hydrocarbons. The shift has been prompted by the fracking revolution that has made the U.S. a surplus producer. U.S. still imports energy, but now oil, but it also exports oil and gas in major quantities as well as distillates. This shift is now being accelerated by the oil market share war and by the global recession/depression caused by the policy response to the COVID pandemic. It's useful, I think, to look at what U.S. policy has been towards in terms of the world oil and world energy markets until very recently. It was the U.S. policy to protect and facilitate the global supply of oil and gas, for not just for itself, but for its commercial and trading partners, particularly its West European and East Asian allies. The policy rested on a special relationship with the Saudi Arabia and the other petrodollar Gulf producers and petrodollar states. The U.S. provided the idea of security protection and guaranteeing the transportation of oil. And in return, the Gulf acted as a swing producer, a pricing mechanism, as you will, keeping oil in a certain Goldilocks range, not too high for U.S. consumers, not too low for U.S. producers. And it also agreed to continue to price the oil in dollars, underpinning and strengthening of the U.S. Dollar's role as a principal reserve currency. And of course, in the case of Saudi Arabia, it threw in buying many U.S. assets and purchasing U.S. weapons. So generally, the U.S. encouraged the development of international supplies, especially supplies that were developed by U.S. flag oil majors. There was an effort to promote the expansion of U.S. oil majors internationally, through the period of the Iraq War and a bit beyond. The U.S. at the same time would seek to restrict supply of oil from strategic rivals or for designated enemies. The long campaign to try to prevent the sales of Russian gas to Europe and constructions of pipelines, the more recent embargoes of Iran and Venezuela. And the U.S. would seek to control the transit and transportation network until recently with Turkey as the favored Eurasian transit hub. All the oil coming either from the Gulf or from Central Asia would pass through the transit hub of Turkey, strengthening Turkey's regional role in oil markets. Now, beginning a few years ago, but now accelerating, there's a major shift in U.S. policy now taking place. The U.S. has moved from the goal of facilitating the international supply to one of actually actively competing with other international suppliers. That's the effect of developing a very robust domestic energy production system. So, as a matter of policy, the U.S. actively promotes the U.S. oil and gas industry. The U.S. has become neo-mercantilist with regard to oil and gas, especially LNG, to gain market share in Europe and Asia. It's therefore also tightened restrictions and sought additional international sanctions against strategic rivals and designated enemies, Russia, Iran, and Venezuela in particular. And it's begun to move away from the special relationship, first with Qatar, and now even the UAE and Saudi Arabia, particularly in the wake of the disastrous oil market share war of the past few weeks. The general posture for the US now is to favor domestic producers over the development of international supplies, even if those supplies are being developed by US flag oil majors. It's less willing to finance or even otherwise support new development or transportation networks. It's no longer willing, I would argue, to go to war to support Gulf production or transport from the Gulf. If you remember, one of the original justifications for American policy in Iraq and Syria was to facilitate the development of natural gas pipeline from Qatar to Turkey to Europe. That was a decade ago. That would not happen. I mean, the US was obviously very unsuccessful, but that would not happen now because Qatar gas is considered as much as a rival to the competitor to the US. It's even almost as much as Russian gas. So my argument is that much of this shift will survive, even if there is a change in administration, but obviously with one important difference is the Democrats will pursue measures to begin to shut down the domestic production in the name of climate change. That may ease some of the pressure of the US to restrict international supplies, but since the policy is generally aimed at shutting down oil and gas development worldwide, it will also continue to have some impact on development of international supplies. Now, this shift in policy, which is occurring, it's not fully materialized, perhaps, but it's well on its way, has great implications for East Med energy development. The US will give rhetorical support for East Med gas development for geopolitical and geoideological purposes or geocivilizational purposes, but will not take any significant actions to ensure its development. The US will talk up the East Med pipeline to Europe as a part of its Cold War with Russia, but will not do anything that makes such a pipeline more commercially or geopolitically viable. The US will give priority to supplying Europe and Asia with US LNG, and therefore may actually create, wittingly or unwittingly, obstacles to East Med development in the short run. East Med would be a competitor with the US. These obstacles may include, quote unquote, tolerating Turkish actions in the East Med, while the US will lodge complaints against Turkey's various claims or actions. It won't take any substantial action to deter Turkey in that regard. That therefore leads to two other conclusions. Having US flag oil majors involved in East Med development, which was once considered a major asset, offers no commercial or geoeconomic advantages, especially now that the US oil majors are cutting development of new fields and shutting down less profitable ones. The US oil majors will be quite content to set on these reserves rather than developing them for the next 3 to 5 years, I would argue. With international markets glutted and with U.S. seeking to gain market share in Europe and Asia, East Med gas development will depend on a growing East Med and regional demand for energy. That in turn depends on a larger growth strategy. I think there are still opportunities, in other words, for East Med gas development, but they're less in competing with European markets, with most European markets, or even most Asian markets. We'll have to develop a much larger Middle East EU RIM market for East Med gas. It also means attracting more and committing more to industrial development, whether it's in Egypt, Ethiopia, even on Cyprus or Levant, Northern Africa, to consume more of the East Med and to have cheap energy available for both household and business purposes in the East Med, in the larger region around the East Med. That concludes my remarks on U.S. policy towards East Med gas development. Thank you.